My name is Molly Anderson, and as Executive Director of the Athenaeum, I want to welcome you to the second Geschke lecture of this summer. The series has been bringing thought leaders to the island since 2005, and it's made possible through the extraordinary generosity of Nan and Chuck Geschke. And I'd like to take a moment for us to thank them for all they do for our island. Tonight's speaker, Jonathan Alterman, is currently Senior Vice President, Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy, and Director of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Alterman received his A.B. from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and his Ph.D. in History at Harvard, where he taught from 1993 to 97. Prior to joining SAIS, he served as a member of the policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State and as a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Studies. Alterman has lectured in more than 30 countries on 5 continents on the Middle East and U.S. policy toward the region. He's the author or co-author of 4 books on the Middle East and editor of 5 more. In addition to his policy work, he often teaches at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and George Washington University. And he's a frequent commentator in print, on radio, and on television. And gracious, I don't know when he sleeps, honestly. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alterman.
Thank you very much, Molly. First, I want to say I am really delighted to be here. Thank you all for welcoming me. Thank you very much to Nan and Chuck Geschke for your generosity, to Molly and Amy and the Athenaeum staff for bringing me here for Congregation Shirat Hayam, where I'm speaking on Friday night. If you like this, that one's free. It's a lower bar. My wife Kathy and I have really had a wonderful, wonderful time being on Nantucket. We've never been before, and I'm really grateful to all of you for helping to make this possible. I want to talk about Saudi Arabia by starting to tell you a story about when I went to Saudi Arabia a little more than a year ago, in March of 2018. And I was interviewing people for some work we were doing at CSIS on how Arabs think about their relationship to their parents and to their tribes and to their state. And it's our sense that this was changing, and we were going to Saudi Arabia, and I was interviewing about 30 people about just talking to them about how do you relate to folks in authority and how is that changing. And my team was in touch with a graduate student at Harvard, and they said, you should meet a guy named Mohammed Rabia, and he's a leftist. I'm thinking Saudi leftist. What the heck does that look like? Because on the one hand, Saudi Arabia is already a welfare state, so what are leftists asking to do? But what does Saudi leftist look like? And I sort of had this image in my mind's eye of this dark, grimy apartment, probably with candles, a Che Guevara poster, maybe beaded curtains, certainly scruffy beards and cigarettes, right? That's got to be what a Saudi leftist is all about. So we take an Uber to a residential area in the southern part of Riyadh. There are a few apartment buildings on the main drag, but mostly walled compounds. And we find the address, and this gate slides open, and there's a long, low building about the size of a double-wide trailer, or maybe in better Nantucket phraseology, it's about the size of the Wheezy Library, a little bit smaller without the lovely cathedral ceiling. Brightly lit, red patterned carpet, low cushions around the perimeter that seat about 40 people. Mohammed greeted us with 3 of his friends. They were all about 30 years old, not a scruffy beard to be seen. They all wore brilliantly white, crisp white robes. Some Southeast Asians served us coffee and dates, and I began to learn about Saudi leftists. And we had a long conversation in Arabic and English, which continued through a delicious dinner buffet that included Arabic, Italian, and Southeast Asian food. Muhammad talked about how tribes in the kingdom have evolved into conduits for state support to the population, but as conduits, they're necessarily subordinate to the state and cannot challenge the state on behalf of their members. He argued that the current consolidation of state power was part of a larger process of diminishing tribal solidarity in the kingdom. He noted that a prominent tribal sheikh was recently arrested and nobody said anything. And Muhammad put this in the context of a broader willingness, of a diminished willingness to challenge authorities on behalf of kinship networks or friends. He pointed out to us that administrators of WhatsApp groups, which are basically, social media email chains, had become more cautious recently because they were considered liable for whatever is posted in their groups. He also said people have become much more cautious about what they said in gatherings, larger gatherings, where they didn't intimately know everybody there. I'd heard a lot about reform in Saudi Arabia, and Muhammad personified it. I mean, he was thoughtful, he was dynamic, he's a critical thinker. He read books, he wanted to talk about books, and it struck me that Muhammad Rabi was precisely the kind of person who was keen to lead the Saudi economy and Saudi society away from over-reliance on oil revenues. I've met some smooth-talking, multilingual consultants who all advertise themselves as I'll be a bridge between Western firms and Saudis, and I'll do all the interpretation. That's not what this kid was. This kid was a Saudi who was Saudi through and through. And he was trying to figure out where to take his country. He understood English. He preferred to talk in Arabic. He wasn't trying to appeal to me. He was trying to understand me. Less than 2 months later, on May 15th, 2018, Muhammad was arrested as part of a crackdown on Saudi women's rights activists. As far as I know, he is in jail right now. He had been active in an organization that sought to provide help to women who had suffered from abuse, and he was taken in along with several of the women who had agitated for women's right to drive in Saudi Arabia. According to Saudi newspapers, he was charged with having suspicious contacts with foreign entities. One Saudi official told me that he had passed government employment data to a foreign embassy, and that constitutes sedition. What nags me about this case isn't that I met somebody who had been arrested. To my sorrow, I know a really unsettling number of people who have been killed for their beliefs. What nags me is that as Saudi Arabia considers the challenges it's facing, I have a hard time imagining how they can succeed without people like Mohammed Arabi at their side, engaged in the enterprise. I want to back up a little bit and tell you something about Saudi Arabia, which is a country we sort of talk about but never really quite spend enough time thinking about. It is a big and important country with a big and important set of problems. Their social and economic model needs to change to adapt to a changing world. I think the first thing we have to start off recalling is just what an incredible transformation Saudi Arabia has been through for the last 75 years. In 1950, the entire kingdom had 200 kilometers of paved roads, no railroads, and no airports. Now, 47,000 kilometers of paved roads, 214 airports, 1,300 kilometers of rail. In 1950, there were no public schools in Saudi Arabia. Now they have 300,000 teachers teaching 3.5 million pupils in primary and secondary education. There is practically universal access to water and sewage, and the country has a $1.6 trillion economy. By any measure, they went from nothing to something pretty impressive. They've done it because they have the world's largest proven reserves of oil. And they are among the world's largest producers of oil. We actually produce more oil than Saudi Arabia does. We don't export more oil than Saudi Arabia does. We produce more oil than Saudi Arabia does because of fracking. But Saudi Arabia, close to us in production, has 6% of the US population. So there's a lot more oil wealth going to a lot smaller number of people. 87% of government revenues come from oil, which represents 42% of Saudi GDP. As a consequence, they don't really have to tax. So the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, developed countries, I think there are 36 countries in the OECD. The highest tax rate is Denmark at 45%. The lowest tax rate in the OECD is Ireland, 23%. And there's Saudi Arabia, 4%. You don't have to tax. Because the state is what they call either a rentier state or a rentier state. I've heard it both ways. The state makes its money, the economy runs on oil. It costs $10 to pump a barrel of oil in Saudi Arabia. They sell it for $65. My wife is a middle school math teacher. I don't need her to tell me there's $55 they make every single time they pump a barrel of oil, and they do millions of barrels of oil a day. And all that money goes to the government. And as a consequence, oil changes the economy, it changes the politics, it changes the way everything works. Oil has allowed Saudi Arabia to flourish as Saudis pursue government jobs with relatively high salaries and relatively low levels of responsibility, while expatriates do a lot of the grunt work. In a nutshell, Saudi Arabia has a high productivity, low wage workforce that subsidizes a low productivity, high wage workforce. That means a lot of foreign workers come in and work for peanuts in Saudi terms. That allows a lot of Saudis to work at government jobs with high salaries, but you don't have to be held accountable because the system doesn't have to be held accountable. The system is, it's a distributive system of the government distributes oil revenues, oil rents, to the population. It's possible in part because of just the way the math works. 3.1 million Saudis are in the workforce, out of about 20 million. 3.1 million are in the workforce, mostly in government jobs. And the government spends about 50% of its expenditures are on salaries, which is about twice the percent of US government expenditures on salaries. And they have 10.7 million expatriates in the workforce, mostly in the private sector. Big public sector, not very productive, not a lot of responsibility, pretty expensive because people are earning high wages, supported by a large private sector, largely expats, largely low paid. This has been great for Saudis for a long time, but everybody knows the game can't go on. It just can't. Oil revenues are flattening, the Saudi population is growing, and the equation is under strain. There's no question looking forward, oil is going to be less central to the global economy in 30 years than it is right now. It just will be. I remember a Saudi minister was sitting in my office about 10 years ago, and he said, you know, my parents were born in a reed hut. And I live in a marble mansion. My kids were born in a marble mansion. what's going to be happening to their kids? It's a real problem. As you look forward, I think the Saudis grasp as much as anybody, when you really think through it, that they have a lot of sort of medium-skilled people, right? They don't have people at the low end, construction workers, industrial, manufacturing. They don't have a lot of Saudis who do that or were willing to do it. And at the high end, the sort of highly educated, highly technical workers, they don't have a lot of those either. They're kind of in the middle. And if you think about the way automation, artificial intelligence are going to work, it's the middle jobs that are the ones getting squeezed. But that's the Saudi workforce. And they understand intellectually they have to make that transformation, but they're unsure how to do it. And they have a bigger problem because the way the economy works, the rentier economics have entrenched the current system. Because the state operates the way it does, because the economy operates the way it does, all of economic and political activities are structured around the state as the distributor of wealth. Business is all built on your ability to hire cheap foreign workers. Construction business, generally in the Gulf, not just in Saudi Arabia, $200 a day for a construction worker. You can build a lot more than $200 a day. I'm sorry, $200 a month. I apologize. I'm thinking Nantucket, which you probably can't get for $200 a day, right? At $200 an hour. At $200 a month, you can build a lot more for a lot less money than you can if you have a minimum wage of, say, $25,000 a year, which is what Saudis would demand. How do you adjust your whole economy? Because you get addicted to cheap labor. You get addicted to cheap foreign workers who can produce stuff. And to the extent you have a Saudi private sector, the Saudi private sector employs a foreign workforce. And how do you make the transition to having a Saudi workforce that's effective? I spoke a fascinating conversation with an Egyptian hotel manager in Jeddah about 5 years ago. And he said, look, we're getting a lot of pressure from the government to hire more Saudis. I could hire Saudis to work at the hotel desk. And I got to teach them better English because the schools don't teach them good enough English. I got to teach them customer service. I got to teach them how to work in an organization and take orders from people, maybe people who aren't Saudis. Maybe I have to take orders from a Filipino or a Pakistani. 2-year process. And it's expensive, and some of them might not last. Or I can just tell this guy, go sit on the corner, you're a security guard. And he can play on his phone. And I've solved my government problem. Except it's created a problem for the government because the person doesn't have any more skills. You haven't Saudiized the workforce, you've created a job that probably leaves somebody feeling pretty miserable anyway, without solving the larger problem of how do you create a workforce that actually feeds national needs. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, has taken this challenge and made it central to everything that he thinks the kingdom has to do. There's no question that other Saudi leaders have said, yeah, we got to do it. But they have a problem. When oil prices are low, it's really hard to do hard things because you can't afford hard things. When oil prices are high, the diet starts tomorrow, right? And so Saudis have been talking for 20 years about the necessity of reform and done tremendously little. And Mohammed bin Salman came in and said, we're going to do a whole bunch. So what do? You hire McKinsey. McKinsey came up with Vision 2030, launched in April 2016. That's the big think. But then how do you implement? Then you hire Boston Consulting Group, which came up with the National Transformation Plan. The National Transformation Plan, I swear to God this is true, 178 strategic objectives, 300 ambitious key performance indicators, achieved simultaneously through 24 government agencies, which led to 534 initiatives. Aha! Then, of course, you come out with National Transformation Plan 2.0, which has 8 dimensions, 37 strategic objectives, and 444 initiatives. But this is shaking the system. Mohammed bin Salman is especially focused on people under 30, which in Saudi Arabia is almost 60% of the population versus 24% in the United States. He has reached out aggressively on social media. He created a foundation directed toward youth empowerment and innovation. They've started having concerts and entertainment in the kingdom, especially highlighted the importance of giving greater rights to women, both in the workforce and in social life. He's trying to energize young people about change in order to create young people's acceptance of less job security, more accountability, less government hiring, and wages that are either flat or going to be declining. In the United States, there was tremendous excitement about Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Here's a guy, he speaks English, which is always an awesome thing, right? He speaks English, he smiles, he's going to be liberalizing Saudi Arabia. Look at all the stuff he does for women. He must be our kind of guy. And there really has been a tremendously visible change in Saudi Arabia. Women are not only in the workforce, women are actually in public space in a way that was never the case before, or not the case in the last 30 years. He made several trips to the United States. The most recent was in the spring of 2018. I saw him right after I came back from Saudi Arabia. For a lot of Western observers, the first sign that something was wrong was with this roundup of the women's rights activists in May 2018, which was simultaneous with women getting the right to drive. So they said women can drive, but by the way, all these people have been agitating, you're going to jail. And the clear message was, when there are new rights to be given, we will give them, and you won't tell us when and how to order them and how to structure them and everything else. In truth, the crackdown in Saudi Arabia had begun at least a year before. I started hearing rumblings about it. Mohammed bin Salman became crown prince in June of 2017, and almost immediately people became more cautious about what they said. They were very cautious about saying anything about public policy that might seem off-key. And at the same time, they were increasingly being pressed to support the Crown Prince's transformation agenda. As one Saudi told me, and I still don't know if he was joking or not, every dissertation written in Saudi Arabia has to have a chapter on how the work advances Vision 2030. You write about chemistry, there's got to be a chapter about Vision 2030. You write about sociology, there's got to be, that's the deal. The reality is Mohammed bin Salman is a modernizing autocrat and not a liberalizing figure. He's trying to normalize the Saudi economy, which is that the economy would feed up into the government and support the government rather than vice versa, without normalizing Saudi politics, which is the government is somehow an extension of its citizenry. The model, which I've heard a lot in the Gulf and elsewhere, is China. China is perceived to be an example of you can change the economy and isolate it from social change. You can create an economic transformation without creating a social transformation. And that's what the Chinese advertise. That's the Chinese say that it's part of the Belt and Road Initiative and all sorts of other things, is we can transform the economy without transforming the society. The US vision, it's not just the United States, it's the one we're at the forefront of, is economics and social transformation go together, which makes people with political power grumpy because they think they might be out of a job. We argue that's good. You should be worried, and that drives you to do the right thing. They get grumpy. Mohammed bin Salman has a legitimate fear that an open debate will give oxygen to critics of modernization and liberalization in the kingdom. That is, there are a lot of backward people who think all these things are miserable. And if you let the liberals talk, then the conservatives will talk, and the conservatives will war with the liberals and they'll war with the moderates, and you won't get anything done. And the only way is to just tell everybody to shut up and go to their corners. I am always shocked when people tell me stories about pockets of liberalism in Saudi Arabia in the 1960s and 70s. People swear to me that there used to be women in bikinis in Jeddah off the beach in the 1970s. That the conservatism in Saudi Arabia was always there, but this form of conservatism, the sort of virulent conservatism, was a response partly to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, partly a response to the attempted takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, which made the gambling, drinking, and womanizing royal leadership uncomfortable about their religious bona fides. And they said, you know what? We'll just give these guys a lot of leash. And there was the war in Afghanistan that fed that flame. But there's a legitimate argument that there actually was liberalism in Saudi Arabia, but there's, I think, that the also legitimate argument that there's a virulent, somewhat new, radical conservatism that could boil up as social change begins to come. The theory of change that the Crown Prince has is that Saudi Arabia is in a race to reach its destination of modernity. It cannot afford delays, and the population needs to be strongly guided. That's the theory. Part of that theory played itself out in the arrest of hundreds of leading Saudis in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. As Kathy and I were at dinner, and somebody whose husband does a lot of work in Saudi Arabia started talking about people who had been ritzed. Getting ritzed brought more than $100 billion to government coffers. But it demonstrated something really clear, which was, we don't care who you are. There's a new sheriff in town. Here's the deal. And there won't be opposition. And for a long time, for decades, the assumption was, the royal family is thousands of princes, and you just can't cross them. It's very hard to get something done. Thousands of princes. And then if you didn't like that, and the clerical establishment, after the 79 and the clerical, you can't move them, and they're really hard. And by the way, the business community, the family needs them, and the Crown Prince has systematically taken on the extended royal family, and taken on the clerical establishment, and taken on the business community with impunity. My last conversation with Jamal Khashoggi was about precisely that issue. Jamal's point to me was that Mohammed bin Salman saw in Saudi Arabia, these pillars of society weren't really nearly as strong as people assumed. That this was a more malleable society than anybody had assumed. And the Crown Prince deserved credit for seeing that reality that nobody else had seen. Jamal agreed with Mohammed bin Salman's view of modernization. But where he differed was he said it can't come without liberalization. People need to buy in. People need to feel a stake. People need to have the ability to tweak things that aren't going in the right direction. People need to be able to, they need to want to take actions that aren't directed from above, but are inspired and guided from above, but come from their own initiative and inspiration. When I speak to business leaders in Saudi Arabia, they say, we agree with the broad principles of Vision 2030, but we can't get answers to really important questions because there's nobody to ask. Because this is a top-down system, they're still filling in the blanks and making stuff up and trying to link things. It's not an organic interaction. It's still very top-down, and they don't even know who to call. And Jamal said that can't work. Jamal agreed with 90% of what the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is trying to do. And he lost his life over the 10% where he disagreed. The reality for us, we don't get to shape Saudi Arabia's future direction. And in fact, we in the United States don't have much influence over Saudi Arabia's future direction. A lot of the discussion in the United States about Saudi Arabia has been about the Crown Prince himself and his future and what this means. But I think we need to think a lot more about Saudi Arabia. I don't think, and I've told senior Saudi royals this, I don't think Vision 2030 can be successful with the Crown Prince as the face of the plan. Outside of banking and the oil and gas industry, I think the Crown Prince not only is radioactive, I think he's going to remain radioactive. But a lot of the ideas contained in the 2030 vision are really necessary. They're well-founded. They're necessities for the kingdom as it makes its transformation. I think that the challenge that we all have is trying to find a way to promote transformation not on behalf of the Crown Prince, but in many ways, despite the Crown Prince, and in the common interests of Saudis and Americans alike. I really think that's the world Mohammed Rabi' was reaching for, and I hope we'll be reaching for again. Thank you. Molly tells me we have some time for questions. So I will try to call on people, and then I'm told them to repeat the questions so everybody can hear it. My question is going to be, can I hear the questions? Because I'm getting more and more middle-aged every year. Sir.
Yeah, can you sort of set the context? You outlined some transformational issues and problems. Can you set the context in terms of religion and sort of balance of power within the Mideast, and how those impact the issues you talked about?
Okay, so the question is about the context of religion and power and political power in the Middle East.
Balance of power among the countries.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so let me, for context, let me leap back 2,000 years. Judaism is a religion that was the religion of an empire. And so Judaism has rules about murder and larceny and debt collection, all kinds of things. Christianity is a religion that grew up inside the Roman Empire, and so it didn't need to develop that kind of stuff. It could stick to theology. And Islam was the religion of empire, so like Judaism, Islam has a long history of essentially religious legislation about women's right to inherit and murder and whether women should be covered, all kinds of stuff. And it's murky, but it creates a presumption of religious relevance to everything that some people take very seriously and some people take less seriously and some people find offensive. But it's a different debate in Muslim and Jewish society than it is in a Christian context. Saudi Arabia as a entity was the mixture of the Saud family and the descendants of a charismatic preacher in 18th century Arabia named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And they kind of made a deal. And the deal was you rule the governance and you rule the religion. And Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was a literalist, and you could argue a sort of fundamentalist who wanted to strip down very austere kind of Islam. That bargain between the two families has lasted since 1744. There's a little bit of a separation of powers, and the Al Saud, the Saud family, has been reluctant to challenge the religious authorities before Mohammed bin Salman. The modern reality is most of religion has nothing to say about most of the things government does all the time. Religion doesn't say anything about telecom policy. It doesn't say anything about a lot of stuff, right? And the argument that Mohammed bin Salman has made is we can't have these vigilante religious enforcers running around. It's going to mess everything up. How that balance fits, I think, is a work in progress. But the core of the Saudi equation has been this idea that there's a division of responsibility, and the religious authorities reinforced the necessity for obedience to the political authorities, which the political authorities liked quite a bit. And that's part of, I think, the Saudi ethos. It's part of the way religion has seeped in to public life, is there's a huge, huge, huge emphasis on obedience to authority, and especially obedience to political leadership, but also to fathers and so on. How that changes, it's very top-down. Modern life is less top-down. It's more, right, collateral. And how that works, I think, is still something a work in progress. Is in fact precisely the reason that we're going and researching this stuff about how people relate to family, tribe, and state, because I think it's in motion. Is that helpful?
Sure.
Okay, thanks. I saw somebody over here. Yes, sir.
Over the last year or so, Trump has come out and at various times stated about how much business the U.S. is doing with Saudi Arabia. And every time he comes out, the number changes. I wondered if you had some perspective about exactly what kind of business we're doing with them. And is the size of that business large enough to justify the treatment of Geschke?
I don't know if any of you have experience in accounting. I'm sorry, the question is how much actual trade do we have with Saudi Arabia, and is it sufficient to justify the treatment of Jamal Khashoggi, who, in case somebody doesn't know, was lured into a Saudi consulate in Istanbul, killed and dismembered. I don't know if any of you have experience in accounting. I have never seen quite as creative an accounting enterprise as I've seen surrounding the numbers about trade with Saudi Arabia. No, I mean, so there's when the deal's been announced, there's when the contract's been signed, there's when the product's been delivered, there's when the service, right? And you get to count all those things once. There's been a lot of multiple counting and everything past and everything future and everything hoped for, and let's get a nice big number. Somebody who I trust told me that he thinks Gulf trade overall creates 3 million US jobs. Maybe. I'm a little bit skeptical of that number. But my guess is that the overall arms trade, I think, is on the order of $10 billion a year, which is significant but not overwhelming.
That's a lot less than Trump is.
Yeah. And but it's non-trivial. No question, for what it's worth, Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner is China, which is true of most countries, including ours. So, okay. Sir. Right.
Is this a trade or is it how it offsets Iraq?
I'm sorry, is it trade or?
Is it Saudi versus Iran? About balance in the Middle East. Is it really a trade issue or is it, how do we use them as an ally against Iran?
Actually, the question is a Saudi-Iran question, which is complicated. So one of the things, so let me step back from that. It's an interesting problem. I have tried to persuade Saudis that, and I think they know this, there are any number of constituencies in the United States that are hostile to Saudi Arabia, right? There are people who say Saudi government was behind 9/11. There are people who say, I hate the way they treat women. There are people who say, I hate the way they treat evangelical Christians and don't let them proselytize. How can you not do that? There are people who are annoyed about their support for people who are hostile to Israel. I mean, there are people who are annoyed about human rights and free speech. There are people who are annoyed about Jamal Khashoggi. And the Jamal Khashoggi case has created a focal point for, and people who are angry about Yemen, and we can talk about Yemen if people are interested about Yemen, near and dear to my heart. Anyway, the Khashoggi case has created a focal point for all these different disparate groups that hate Saudi Arabia for all different reasons to come and say, aha, these guys are really SOBs. The only country less popular than Saudi Arabia in the United States is Iran, right? And I don't know, and the fact is, I remember the hostage crisis, but there aren't people much younger than me who remember the hostage crisis. But the Iranians have no constituency in this country. They just don't. There's no business constituency, the ethnic constituency. Most of the Iranians in the US fled Iran and lost a fortune in the process. And for many of the same reasons of Saudi Arabian support for Hezbollah and support for Palestinian Islamic Jihad and go on. There's no question in my mind that the Crown Prince wants the United States to be very aggressive politically and militarily against Iran. I'm not sure that actually is going to be successful changing Iranian behavior. In fact, I think it's not going to be successful changing Iranian behavior. I have a very weird career. It didn't sound as weird when Molly read it. I do weird stuff. So I had this really interesting conversation in the office in Damascus of one of the chief Syrian negotiators for their various things. And he was proudly telling me how he learned his negotiating strategy. I can't remember if it was from the Bulgarians or the Romanians, but his point was every time you go into the room, you repeat word for word what you said the time before until the other side gives in, and then you've gotten something. And I looked at him, and I said, and after 30 years, how much of the Golan have you gotten back with your strategy? But I think the Syrians, like the Iranians, are preoccupied with their sense of weakness. I mean, Iran is an oil-producing state, 80 million people with a GDP the size of Maryland coming up against the United States. We've got not only a multi-trillion-dollar economy, we've armed all of our friends around them. The Navy sees everything that goes on in the Gulf. Europe is with us, right? I think the Iranians are preoccupied with every day I survive, that's a big victory. And I think the Iranians have spent 40 years figuring out ways, A, to survive, and B, to act like you're still able. It's like the Knights Who Say Ni, if you're a fan of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right? They're still there, they're still kicking, they're still able to counterpunch. I worry that the Saudi instinct on Iran, which is, and then the Israeli instinct is let's get the Americans to squeeze the Iranians, doesn't actually change the Iranian behavior. It provokes more undesirable Iranian behavior and gets us deeper into this spiral. I think at the end of the day, neither country is really going away. At the end of the day, the likelihood of either government being dramatically different from the way it is now is probably somewhat low. So we got to find a way with the Iranians, with the Saudis, to get by. Not because it's going to be perfect, but because it's going to be better than a lot of alternatives of open hostilities. I saw somebody over here. Yes, sir. Right there. Yep, you.
You painted a picture of one person at the top and a lot of people at the bottom looking for direction who don't have the history of taking initiative on their own.
Yeah.
Where do you see that going? Because if you haven't described any mechanism to change that, what happens next?
Okay, so the question is, I described a system with somebody loves to give direction at the top, people at the bottom who are very passive. I didn't describe a process by which that structure changes, so what the heck happens to it? I think you have to create processes that begin to feed up. I think you have to create pockets of entrepreneurship. I think this is one of my big points to Arab governments, and they sort of look at me a little bit crosswise. I think you have to teach people it's okay to fail. And I think about it, the example I've given is my son was a high school baseball player. And he lost a bunch of games. That was really important. He learned how to lose. He learned how to go back and do better so he didn't lose the next time. A lot of these societies not only don't have team sports for boys or girls, but people aren't used to losing. Because the consequences of losing in a Bedouin society is you go die alone in the desert, right? And the consequences of losing in a society when the government is the principal employer is if you lose, you're really abandoned. And the argument I've made to people, thus far unsuccessfully, but next year I'll be, right? The argument I made to people is you have to make it okay to fail. You have to let people make smart mistakes. You have to encourage people to learn from mistakes. I mean, somebody told me a story about a sister of hers who worked for Instagram. And I guess the CEO had the leadership in the room and said, now, how many of you guys have been part of a failing enterprise? And everybody around the table raised their hand. It's okay, well, how many of you saw the failing enterprise doing something that you thought was stupid and threw your body in front of it and said, you just can't do that? A smaller number of people raised their hands a little bit sheepishly. And the head of Instagram said, I need every one of you to do that. If you see something that you think is really stupid, you have to say something. I think that the idea, failure is okay, and if you see something that's going to promote failure, do something about it. that's not where a lot of the Middle East is. I'm not sure how much of America is there, to be honest, but it seems to me that that's where we're going to have to be. It's the only way you can get the necessary agility. I think nobody is smart enough to substitute for the judgment of lots and lots and lots of smart people who are experimenting. And to me, the future has to be training people to take smart risks, learn from them, and then rewarding people for doing things that weren't sure to work, but ended up working. And it seems to me that that's how you get there. How you get there in Saudi Arabia between 2019 and 2020, I don't think you can get there between 2019 and 2020. Can you get there by 2030? I think you can create a lot of interesting experiments that get you closer. And education is, one of the places to do it. And educational reform is hard everywhere. It's not just hard here, really hard. Yes, ma'am.
I've heard it said that the Saudi oil reserves may be far more depleted than the Saudis like to proselytize. As you talk about the welfare state and the sort of nothing that would, in the foreseeable future, sort of change the quote-unquote status quo and the way the government and the economy works, seems to me that if the oil reserves are not as replete as they suggest, and that's highly debated at this point, is my understanding, that things could have to change quite dramatically and potentially fairly quickly because they wouldn't be preparing for it coming.
Okay.
Is there a preparedness for that coming? Is there honest discussion about the oil reserves and how do they integrate that into how they see their country modernizing
Right.
over the next?
So about 10 years ago, I'm sorry, the question is, are the Saudis lying about their oil reserves? Do they actually have as much? And if they don't have as much as they claim, are they planning for that future? About 10 years ago, there was an idea floating around that the Saudis had reached peak oil. The world had reached peak oil, that we had found the oil that could be found and production was going to start declining and we'd all need to find something else to power things and to make plastics and the other things people use oil for. Then the fracking revolution happened. Totally changed the game. Made the US the largest oil producer in the world. The current thinking in Saudi Arabia is people are going to stop caring about oil before we run out of oil. They remain the lowest cost producer in the world. They're going to remain the lowest cost producer. When oil is $15 a barrel, for most people, it will not be economical to make oil. The Saudi Arabians will still be pumping oil. But as the former oil minister Zaki Yemeni used to say, the Stone Age didn't end for lack of stones. And they understand that oil is not going to stay valuable. And then the question is, how aggressively should you pump now? Understanding if you pump more oil, it might depress the price, but at least you get some dollars out before the oil becomes much less valuable. And that's actually the hard question that they're debating, is are they better off in a low price environment where they're pumping more of the oil and maybe coming closer to depleting it, or a high price environment? And the problem with a high price environment is that then you make it economical, not only for other producers to make more oil, but you make it easier for all the people doing unconventional oil and gas to do more oil for all the fracking. Because, there used to be fracking, but as long as oil is below $80 a barrel, you can't make money fracking. And they're making money fracking at about $40 or $35 a barrel is what it costs now for some fields. And there's a trend line, the trend line goes in one direction. And the Saudis are looking at this, and that's the conundrum they have, is if you're looking at the time series of income over 50 years, do you want to do high production at low prices? For how long, and how do you manage it? And that's the debate. So, sir in the back.
So I subscribe to your notion about the idea that to change the culture through education, but in fact, can that really happen with the top-down government as it is, without the leadership subscribing to that? Or is there another mechanism to allow that in fact to happen?
So the question is, can you change educational culture with a leadership that wants top-down culture? I think, so my view, and I've expressed this to some senior Gulf leaders to quizzical looks, is you can't be economically successful unless you change the model. I still remember being stunned. I think my youngest son was in second or third grade and was asked to write a persuasive essay. He wrote that black bean chili is the most disgusting food in the world. But we're teaching our kids to make arguments at a young age. We're teaching them you should have an opinion. We're teaching them, in some cases, there's no right answer. And we were talking at dinner, my kids had a physics teacher. In physics, there's a right answer. The physics teacher said there might be a right answer. I'm not going to tell you. You guys work it out amongst yourselves. Right? It's not just rote education. You're not just going to memorize the formulas. You're going to learn how knowledge acquisition really works. I don't know how you can compete in a 21st century economy with rote memorization education systems. Because the reality is, more and more is accessible more and more quickly on phones and computers and databases and all those things. And the question is, what the heck do you do with it? Memorizing data doesn't get you anywhere. You have to memorize some stuff so you can have an architecture in your mind of how things work. But ultimately, the high skill quality is knowing the meaning of it, and the meaning of it has to be taught through a more organic system driven on reasoning and things like that. I think that's where the educational systems have to go. Whether they will, how quickly they will, where they will and where they won't, I don't know. I think China actually will be an interesting example of this, an interesting model. Some of this is going on in China with people thinking about how education should work. But my own sense is that over the next 30 years, we're going to be reevaluating educational models for what we need people to be able to do, what kind of tools get them there, and then the side question is what are the social and political consequences of training people in different ways. But I just don't think you can compete economically with people who just memorize stuff. And I think people kind of get it and are going to have to get it even more. So, sir, on the end, yeah.
You mentioned Yemen. I read the other day the UAE is pulling their troops out, and the UAE troops were the only good troops of the Saudi-UAE alliance. Why can't they win in Yemen?
The question is, why can't the Emiratis win in Yemen? Why can't the Saudis win in Yemen? If you have 6 hours, I'd be happy to talk about Yemen, but nobody's going to give me. I spent, as Kathy knows, I spent a month in Yemen in 1992 backpacking, and it was absolutely fascinating. As it turns out, it was like the height of optimism in the last 500 years in Yemen. It was the summer I was there in 92. The Houthis control 80% of the population of the country. And they run a bunch of protection rackets. People have no way to really dislodge them. They are poor and starving. And the reality is really poor people don't revolt. It's people who are more middle class, who aren't always looking for how am I going to eat today. Those people don't revolt. Those people spend all their time thinking about how am I going to eat today. The Saudis do not have a very good military. I was told that their pilots can bomb or fly, but they can't fly and bomb at the same time. They're bad at reading maps. They're bad at targeting. They have tried to wage an air war unsuccessfully. And the Houthis are people who are bored. They're used to living without water and electricity, so you can bomb the water and electricity. You're like, well, that's the way I've been living, right? They say, what's the point? And partly they're in it for adventure, and partly they're in it because there's a racket where people can get salaries for working for the Houthis. So I think that the Saudis went into this thinking it was going to be a walk and it wouldn't be a problem. And they got mired down and tried to do it all from the air. And I think the Iranians, as far as I can tell, nobody really knows how much the Iranians are spending on the Houthis in Yemen. My guess is about $10 million a month. The Saudis are spending between $2 and $5 billion a month and dragging their reputation through the mud. For Iran, which is totally preoccupied with its weakness vis-a-vis the Saudis, here's a way to stick it to the Saudis. It costs, if it's $120 million a year, it costs the Iranians about twice as much to support the Houthis in Yemen as it costs to run a think tank in Washington. I would argue the Iranians are getting a bigger bang for the buck, right? I mean, they're really, and you know, suffering of Yemenis, the Iranians don't care about suffering of Yemenis, they're sticking it to the Saudis. And the Saudis can't get out of it. The Emiratis said, you know what? We will defend what we need to defend, but we're not going to do this forever. We can't do it forever. It's going to ruin our relationship with the United States. It's going to ruin our international reputation. It's going to cause the death of a whole bunch of Yemenis. We're done. They understood that the military task of trying to take Hodeidah, which is the main port that supplies the country, would result in thousands or tens of thousands of casualties and would incur casualties on Yemeni forces as well. And the way Secretary Mattis got the Yemenis to back off initially when they're all gung-ho is he sat down, the head of the Yemeni Special Forces is a retired Australian Special Forces general, a guy named Mike Hindmarsh. And he sat down and said, you know what? This would be really hard for us to do. We're better than you, and it's really hard for us. I don't think you guys can do it. And the Emiratis tried to look and tried to push and he said, you know what? We're out of here. The Saudis still need to find the door. And one of the challenges they have is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman took Yemen as one of his early initiatives and said, this thing will be a cakewalk. And it wasn't a cakewalk, it was a briar patch. And this is precisely what the Iranians are great at, right? The asymmetrical, you spend lots of money, we spend a little money. We prevent stuff from happening. We can't make anything happen, we can prevent other things from happening, that's cool. And the Saudis walked into that trap, and now the Saudis have to find a way out. And you know, my frustration is I think the Trump administration, frankly, has not put creativity and energy into resolving this, because I think several years ago when Rex Tillerson was Secretary of State and when Rex Tillerson used to live in Sana'a in Yemen, I think he could have just said, look, this can't go on. And we kind of said, go do it. And I think it has festered. It's created huge humanitarian catastrophe. There are 16 million Yemenis in danger of starvation, 3 million kids. I mean, it's just a million cholera cases. I mean, it's absolutely horrid, with no end in sight. And Saudis have put billions of dollars in humanitarian assistance. The Emiratis put billions of dollars in humanitarian assistance. But as I say, the Iranians are sort of giggling at their cleverness and good fortune. So, oh, we don't control the Houthis. Go figure it out. And I think what will happen is the Houthis will essentially have control over most of certainly northern Yemen for many years to come. I'm told we have time for one more question, and it goes to you. Your hand was up right there, just in my line of sight as I was responding to Molly. She brought down the hammer.
I'm just curious, in your time that you've spent there, have you ever interacted with a woman in a decision-making position? And if you haven't, do you see that on the horizon?
Questions: have I, in all my time in the Middle East, have I ever encountered women in decision-making positions? And if I haven't, well, I have. So let's leave the if I haven't. So I know a lot of women who have ascended to positions of tremendous authority. It's partly a generational thing. So a lot of them are. So there's a generation of women who 20 years ago were taking senior managerial roles. And in my experience 20 years ago, mostly living in Egypt, the most impressive people I met were all female, and they all covered their hair. The extent to which this was because religion gave them a rooting, the extent to which they said, I'm not going to fight the feminism thing and the secularism thing. I'll just, right, I'll do the religious duty piece, but I also want to be myself. I don't know. But so there have been women in senior positions, sort of managerially, for decades. In the more recent past, I have female friends who've become ministers. I sometimes look at ministerial lists, like, I know him, I know her. Why is it all my friends and I'm still working in a think tank? Wrong citizenship, I guess. It's always, look, the reality is there's still social burdens. There's an expectation of marriage. There's an expectation of not going far from your husband, not always subordinating your career, but sometimes, not always. There's a sort of sense that you're not going to push the secularism piece and the feminism piece and the political piece. You don't do all of those. Just do your political job and do it well and do it competently. And several of them are, doing gangbuster jobs. We have done a lot of executive education at CSS for people from the Middle East. And one of the really interesting phenomena is, in my experience, usually the best 2 or 3 students tend to be male. They just are. And they're kids who are multilingual and smart and creative and entrepreneurial and all those things. It's like, wow, this kid's an all-star. And then sort of the A- B+ students are about 80% female. And almost all the women are in the A- B+ range. And they are creative, and they start to get really excited, and they feel empowered, and they're responsible, and they're studious, and they do all those things. I have rarely had women among the C and D students. There are guys who say, my father's an ambassador, you can't do anything to me. Okay. Never women. Because the women who come over are women who want to do something different, don't take anything for granted, don't have this sense that I can just have a job and, right? I mean, there's not a sense of entitlement. That in societies where a lot of the men have entitlement, the women don't feel a sense of entitlement. The women feel a sense of opportunity. And they're awesome, and some of them are going to be awesome. I've seen some women go, and they've done incredible, incredible things. It is still hard. It is not the same. Women's equality is in a whole different place in the Middle East than it is in Western countries. But I think the seeds are planted, and as more and more of these women both are given opportunities, and then see the women just ahead of them change the world. I think this is coming. This is coming. There are incredible, and their great advantage is inside of them is an impetus for change. Men in the Middle East don't always have an impetus for change. So I just have to have a pulse and I'll get a salary. Women don't think that. And they think, how can I make this better? And that, I think, is the key to transformation. And we're seeing it all over the place in small places. We're seeing a lot more of it in the last 5 years than we saw before. There's a lot of interesting stuff. I'll close with a really funny story. I was speaking in Copenhagen, and I was talking about the diversity of women in the Middle East. And I said, for instance, I know a woman who's an anarchist, feminist Islamist. And this guy looked at me and said, oh yeah, I know Heba. I'm seeing Heba in Istanbul in 2 weeks. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.